Good afternoon. It's John Turner, the head of the mining group at Fasken Martineau, welcoming you to today's roundtable discussion with senior mining executives. It's a pleasure to welcome you, and we've got an excellent panel today. And it's, as usual, it seems interesting times in the mining sector. On the one hand, we've got commodity prices, which have generally been strong. Precious metals have gone up and then sort of flattened out a little bit. Electric vehicle battery prices, battery metals have increased significantly. There's a lot of interest in the sector in terms of infrastructure, and other metals have been running because of that. On the other hand, we have a pandemic, and we've got a panel here today to tell from IAMGOLD, IA Gold and Silver, Hudbay Minerals, and Quebec Precious Metals to talk about the next phase of the pandemic and some of the impact it's had on their operations, and also to discuss its impact on some of the other challenges and opportunities in the sector, including ESG and other matters. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass it on to my partner, Frank Mariage, to introduce the panelists and take.
Thank you, John, for the introduction. Hello, everybody, and thank you for having accepted our invitation to this roundtable. Before I present our guests, I think we'll all remember where we were 18 months ago when the pandemic hit. I can tell you that it was this, for me, a certain March 11th. That was the morning that the article, I think in the Globe and Mail, broke out of the COVID case at PDAC, and got about 4 or 5 calls from somebody in human resources at Fasken asking me how I felt that day. And then at the end finished with asking me to go home and come back in 2 weeks. And next thing you know, 2 days later, the province of Quebec shut down. I think you all have similar stories. And and needless to say, here we are just a bit over 18 months later, and the world's changed. This might be a cliche, but it's true. And obviously its effects on the mining industry are still being felt today. And I think we're going to look at that today. In preparing for this call, for this roundtable, I fell upon this study from McKinsey & Company, which was released in 2020, which is pretty interesting. Obviously, looking to learn lessons learned from the past about what's the effect on the mining industry is. And the study they did is, and they found that analysis of major crises in the last decades show that they've each followed similar patterns or four phases. Phase 1 was price shock. Phase 2 was demand shock. Phase 3 was new supply demand equilibrium. And phase 4, demand recovery and the next normal. Very interesting, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about that today. As with our panel, obviously, as John mentioned, we look to explore what are the challenges and opportunities and risks the mining industry may face in this unfolding era. So let's get to it, shall we? Allow me to introduce our fellow panelists who have accepted to participate in this roundtable, which I wish to thank them again. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Mrs. Daniella Dimitrov. Daniella is Executive Vice President and the CFO of IAMGOLD Corporation, where she oversees all aspects of finance, information technology, and investor relations. She joined IAMGOLD in the spring of 2021 from Sprott Capital Partners, where she was partner investment banking. Prior to Sprott, she served as CEO of Orvana Minerals, a junior gold copper producer, as Executive Vice Chair of Baffinland Iron, an iron ore developer, as CEO of Dundee Securities, and in various corporate development roles in mining and financial services. Daniella also has over 15 years experience in governance, serving or having served on a number of boards in mining, oil and gas, and industrial space. She is currently Director of Nexa Resources, Chemtrade Logistics, and a member of the Mining Advisory Group of the Ontario Government. Daniella, welcome, and thank you for joining us. Our next guest.
Thank you, Frank.
My pleasure. Our next guest, Mr. Cashel Meagher, who is the Senior Vice President, Chief Operating Officer of Hudbay Minerals. Cashel trained as a geologist and spent much of his 25 years experience practicing in all the facets of mining, from mine discovery, development, operation, and closure. After spending 9 years with Inco Valley, Cashel has been with Hudbay in ever-progressing roles with Hudbay over the last 13 years. He was the accountable executive for approximately 5 years, overseeing the construction and operation of the Constancia mine located in the high Andes in Peru. Cashel, welcome and thank you for joining us. Our next guest, Mr. Normand Champigny, is the Chief Executive Officer and Director of Quebec Precious Metals Corporation. He is a geological engineer with extensive experience with both public and private companies, both domestically and internationally, and is currently a Director of Bonterra Resources. He has been involved in many facets of the mining industry, including engineering, project evaluation, and project management. Until recently, Mr. Champigny was an executive committee member of the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada. He was chair of the board of directors of Mine Alliance, an organization raising awareness about the mining industry in Quebec and highlighting its positive contribution to Quebec's social, economic, and environmental development. Mr. Champigny is a graduate from École Polytechnique in Montreal, University of British Columbia with a master's, and Paris School of Mines. Normand, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here this morning. Thank you, Frank.
And finally, Mr. Benoit Salle. As I mentioned to Benoit just before our call, I have his bio in French, so I will be translating it. I will be winging it, as they say, so please understand. So Benoit Salle is the President and Chief Executive Officer of IAMGOLD and Silver since May 2020. He is also Executive Vice President of the Board for SRG Mining since 2017. After having founded the accounting firm Groux, Lassalle & Associés in 1980, Benoit is the founder of Semafo, who you all know, who founded in 1995, where he held the position of president and CEO until August of 2012. That same year, he was appointed as our chairman of the board of the Conseil Canadien pour l'Afrique of Samer Resources, and at the end of 2015, he joined the board of Earth Alive Clean Technologies. Benoit is also chairman of the board of the Plan International Canada, one of the principal NGOs in Canada. He has an MBA with honors from the, Benoit, you'll have to help me there, the NCAD, is it NCAD? No, in Lausanne, and has a bachelor's from the IMD, sorry. And has a bachelor's degree from McGill University. Benoit, thank you for joining us this morning and this afternoon, sorry, and welcome. Just before we get into it, just want to explain how this is going to proceed. So we're going to have a Q&A session, exchange and discussion among our executives for about 65 minutes, and then there will be a Q&A. So all those attending, if you wish to ask a question to our panel, please submit your question via the chat function, and I will do my best to ask it to our panel. Just one thing in advance, a note, Daniella unfortunately has to leave us at 1:10, so Daniella will not be available to answer any of your questions, but we are fortunate enough to have her participate on the panel and to give us her insights on the topics today. So let's get to it. Daniella, I'll ask you the first question. So here we are just a bit over 18 months into the pandemic. What has been you would say the number one COVID-19 related challenge on your company's operations?
Thank you, Frank. We have 3 operating mines and 1 major project under construction. Our 3 operating mines are located in Canada, Burkina Faso, and Suriname. And the project that we started building at the beginning of 2021 is located in Northern Ontario, just south of Timmins. The first major challenge, Frank, you touched on earlier in your remarks when you were talking about being advised that the Quebec government was shutting down a number of operations that were not considered to be essential. And and mining was one of those in Quebec. So our first challenge when the pandemic started in 2020 was the actions that governments took in certain jurisdictions, not all jurisdictions, but in certain jurisdictions around actually shutting down operations and mining not being considered a critical operation. That was not the case in Suriname, but I know in a number of parts of South America, and I know Cashel will speak to that, mining operations were shut down for quite a period of time. The next challenge that really followed for us once in Quebec, the operations could restart, for us was in Suriname. And although we were able to maintain operations, over the course of the last 12 months, we've had approximately 25% of our workforce that has had COVID. And so the impact on labor availability initially, and then also subsequently on productivity, has been significant for us in that jurisdiction. We've had to make changes to our infrastructure in Suriname. So we added about 340 beds to our camp in order to restrict mobility of the workforce back into community. In Burkina Faso, again, although initially we've been able to continue operations all through the pandemic, initially we implemented longer rotations. And so we went to a 28-day in and 28-day out rotation, which at the end of the day does have an impact on morale. It has an impact on productivity to see the extension of those longer rotations. At Côté in Northern Ontario, our impact has not been material from a labor perspective, either availability or productivity. However, we've had to implement lots of additional measures there as well as at our operations. So right now we do test everyone that comes into the site. We actually do bus our contractors on site from Timmins and from Sudbury. So we test everyone before they get on the bus. We test people on site. We test people periodically. And we have installed a system that's attached to the wastewater of our dormitories at Côté. So we periodically test the wastewater coming from the camps to make sure that if we miss something along the way, that we're able to pick it up through that testing. And through the piece, we have identified some positives, and in some cases, that's turned out to be the case. Most often, the system misidentifies positives, but again, at the end of the day, it's better to be safe than sorry. So certainly, from a cost perspective, obviously, the implementation of these measures, along with education, contribution to vaccine launch in the jurisdictions has added to our cost structure.
Thanks, Daniella. That's very interesting. Cashel, I mean, Daniella mentioned your operations in Latin America, so I honestly, over to you. Would love to hear what's been the COVID-19 related challenges for Hudbay.
Yeah, many. And you'll probably hear that most of these operations and many of the challenges are in parallel or similar. And I think there's been a lot of sharing of information across the industry, actually, to be able to learn from what unique solutions other people have done, like IAMGOLD with the wastewater and a few other things that have happened. Certainly, as a major theme, the most interruptive was we had as Daniella said, we had a government mandated shutdown for about 4 weeks, and that obviously interrupts production, and any slowdown or startup is an introduction of cost, and was very interruptive in Peru. Peru itself suffered as a nation probably one of the higher death tolls per capita of any of the nations in the world, at least publicly. I'm sure there are other nations that didn't have the infrastructure Peru did for reporting positive cases or what have you. We did remarkably well for the number of people or any sort of containment on site using similar methods that Daniella explained, and things like, antigen testing early on. We actually have quarantine accommodation for the extended placement of these workers. It's a 6-hour bus ride from two of our major centers to the mine. So we would pre-quarantine up to 11 days, all the workers going to the mine. We've also had to accelerate the process by which management would have to work from home and not go to the mine and sort of rely on communication tools, cell phones, video conferences to be able to accommodate it. So while we had all that, one of the major themes that has happened, and there's been different phases of it, one I sort of wrote down knowing this question might be asked, was logistics. And it's logistics about supply and logistics about accommodation. And so at different periods in the pandemic with our different operations, we suffered from supply. And the initial ones were just the ones you took for granted before. It was, we have mandated areas within our mines where N95 respirators are required. And then early on, there was, governments were starting to take all these off the supply chain, and you would try and get in line with major corporations and preferential treatment with places like 3M. That was very difficult to begin with because, one of the things is you want to have a good, healthy workplace, and can you work in those environments without that filtration? We came very close to the line a number of times with our own inventory. And then we had our own workers, of course, taking all these things because they were considered of value. So that was a major, both in Manitoba and Peru. As Daniella pointed out, the accommodation, we've had to increase the accommodation at both of our remote sites, both Lawler and Peru Constancia. And that accommodation, not only do you have to increase it, but you also have to provide the social distancing. And a lot of these contractor accommodations, there might be 4 or 2 to a room, and that was no longer available to us. So we had to reduce the number of people we had at the mine. What that does, that's just got a snowball effect that some sustaining capital work doesn't get done, some pre-stripping doesn't get done, some capital development doesn't get done. And so you're constantly changing mine plans. There's a lot of stress on the system and this idea that you want to maintain quarantine. So those are the major ones, I would say. Some of the ones we didn't think of is, local xenophobia, local communities, for example, afraid of workers coming into their regions from various places and sort of having to deal with that balance between, we want to maintain revenues and continue paying wages. We want to keep the mine open, but at that token, meet the community of, for example, of Snow Lake in Manitoba or Uchucarco or Chiloroya in Peru, meet their major concerns of their worry that they don't have, both in Snow Lake and in those places in Peru, they don't have the health infrastructure that we take for granted here in the first world. And so overwhelming of ICU beds. And I think one of the most critical ones is working at altitude in Peru, we no longer had availability of oxygen. And that was a big one for us because that's what we used for primary care for soroche or altitude sickness. And so that was also being commandeered by the local governments for, rightfully so, for their ICU wards and what have you. But those were the major things. But logistics around all those was primarily the most difficult thing to adapt to.
Okay. Very interesting. You mentioned the community being afraid of workers coming in from abroad. And honestly, Normand, I'll turn it over to you because, most of your operations are in the James Bay area. I understand there was some back and forth with the Cree Nation and the special actions that you needed to take before you could go on site. So maybe over to you about what the challenges are, and if you want to talk about that as well.
Thank you, Frank. So we operate in James Bay, as you mentioned, which is a Cree territory. And right away, the Cree Nation and the Cree authorities took a very conservative approach, which was to essentially minimize any contact between people who live in the area and people coming outside of the area, such as us, to do exploration. And even with their own people that were stationed in southern part of Quebec could not return for quite a while. As some of you may know, also the Quebec government forced exploration companies and mining companies to shut down for a few weeks. And then for the Cree territory, for James Bay, we engaged with them to establish a protocol that would have to be reviewed by them before we go back, which we did, and so as other companies. On our side as well, we had a camp that's been running there for some time, and we're talking about expulsion camps, so they're not permanent installations, but this was an opportunity for us to actually move the camp and have greater distances between the various tents and facilities that we have there, which we did during the course of the summer. And the greatest impact has been obviously on the people. We have a small number of people doing drilling and surface work. We made sure that they were tested initially, and now that they are fully vaccinated. Today, after all that time, the Crees are still very careful. The closest community that working with is in Wemingey in Quebec on the coast. And to their credit, they've achieved they believe, the highest vaccination rate in the country at 95%, 2 doses. But it's still required today, even for Cree people that are coming from outside, to have a 7-day quarantine period, which has not allowed us to engage them face to face, which we need to. So we've done, as everyone has done, Zoom calls and email, which is not the best, especially with those community. But all things considered, this has been managed properly. We've been able to work, I would say, at a slower pace. There's been a disruption in supply chain, which I can talk about later as well, on a number of fronts. I would say the main one has been with the laboratory that we're using for analysis, which is overloaded, and also their own difficulty to manage their supply chain, and also with the drilling companies.
Okay, thanks, Normand. And Benoit, let's over to you. You and I talked about this last week. IAMGOLD and silver present in Morocco, a country that was pretty badly hit by the COVID. Your operations in a remote area, the Zgounder mine. Maybe you could talk about the COVID-related challenges for IAMGOLD and silver.
Well, everything that's been said so far, we've experienced, like everybody, like everyone else. But the other element that we had is there were no more flights into Morocco. So, when you have to send some expats, and if you recall, we took over Aya at the beginning of COVID, and it was a turnaround story. So we needed to send over our geos, our technical team, our metallurgists, everybody, and we just could not get to site. First of all, Canada didn't want us to leave. We didn't qualify as important people. We couldn't get out. We couldn't get into the country. And then because Morocco was badly hit, there were restrictions of traveling between cities. So even when we got there and we landed in Casablanca, we had to go through so many demands in order to get to site that we took over in March. And really, we were able to go to site approximately in August, September. And it was extremely difficult. Now, yes, we did a lot of Zoom and we did that, but that's not enough when you're in a turnaround situation. So, and of course, the number of cases, like Cashel just said, I mean, we were creeping up on site, and then we had to shut down people coming in and coming out. So, the cross shifts ended up being no more cross shifts, as people stayed on site for months and months without coming out. So you lose productivity, you get into other issues. But and one of the problem in sending in, once we were able to send in expats, is, as you know, we got to take these tests to come back and to be negative. If you test positive while you're there, you're not coming back. And the health system is at capacity. So you have COVID, you better have a soft case, because if you have a pretty complicated case, their system is at capacity. And that's been the same, because we also have projects in Mauritania, and it's very risky to send expats on site and then hope for a negative, a test on their way back. So the whole risk for employees became extremely high, and we had to manage this accordingly. And see, even today, there used to be 7 flights a week, Montreal, Casablanca, and there are none right now. So even now, we're in the 4th phase now of the virus, we still have complicated transport issues, and I'm not even talking about the local issues, but just for us to really manage the company, we do get around that, but it's complicated.
Well, interesting. What about but what about the Cashel talked about on-site measures? So did Daniella. Any specific on-site measures you'd like to talk to us about? That you
well, we all of us all reacted very quickly. We became a country in itself. We became a country, so we established our own rules of being checked in and test on site, rapid test on site, isolation coming in, isolation coming out, more beds. I mean, we all did the same because we tried to stay in operation. The big risk that we all had is governments. If your percentage of employees that had COVID, went above a certain level, they would shut you down, and they would then make the decision when you can restart. And restarting a mine is a complicated process, and it's a very expensive process. So we, all of us were managing to minimize the number of cases on site. So we went through all of the steps, and we also initiated a vaccine clinic, if you want, on site, because that was not easily available in Morocco. So, and we tried even through the Canadian Embassy to get Pfizer and to get some of the vaccines, and it was impossible. So we established some contacts with local clinics, and we asked our people to go and get some vaccination, or vaccinated, and hence today. We're back to normal. Morocco is back to normal, and now we just need the airlines to agree to that and start flying in and out of Morocco or of West Africa. I did a tour of West Africa recently, and when you go from one country to the next, you got to go through your testing. You got to go in. It's really not fun. It used to be fun, but it's not fun anymore. So it has an effect on how we manage all of our projects.
Yeah. Well, before we go on to our next question, there's something I need to touch on because you've all mentioned it. Normand, you talked about the need to engage with the Cree community, but unable to see them. Had to do Zoom calls. Obviously, we've all been managing our businesses virtually through Teams, Zoom, whatever, and the boots on the ground approach is very difficult, as Benoit stated, with Morocco, with no more flights. How much of a challenge has that been for you? Whoever wants to go first.
Sure. I'll give an example. The industry expected us to bring on this satellite deposit for years, and we were finally making great headway. And it was called Papacancha in Peru, and we just needed a few community processes. They need to vote in 66% because of the community needs support the dispersion of land, and that particular process is very onerous, and there's a lot of community meetings and a lot of FaceTime trusts that our team on the ground needed to do. And of course, that assembly of that number of people and those things were banned. And so, we kept getting asked by the street, like, when I thought this was imminent, and we're like, well, there's a pandemic, and so we're doing our best to get it. And it was like you basically, when we started at Constancia, it was llama pasture, and then we brought in cell phones, we brought in internet. These were people that didn't have running water, and now you can imagine 10 years later, we're telling them to agree to these deals over these platforms that the elders in the community would never have been exposed to in their lives. And so it took more time. The team did amazing work and very successful. And during this period, we managed to start mining at Papacancha. But it just the things you take for granted disappeared, and those became logistical challenges that were the norm before. That would be my sort of bit there.
Daniella, anything on that?
Yeah, I would add to that, and definitely similar experiences, to Cashel. When I think about it too, is also the overwhelming effect that it's had on the supply chain in general. I don't think a day goes by right now, and here we are. As someone said, we're in the fourth wave. But we're certainly seeing vaccine rates in a number of the jurisdictions in which all of us operate collectively having increased over the last 3 to 6 months. But that supply chain effect is ongoing and is increasing. Those bottlenecks, the impact of inflation, freight alone over the last 2 months has gone up by a factor of almost 4 times. And we're seeing it not just in our industry. A number of the retailers and so on, everyone is experiencing that. So I think if I dial the clock back 12 months ago, and I think about where would we be, 12 months from the summer of 2020, at that time, having heard news about the vaccines progressing, I don't know that we would have seen the supply chain disruption as something that was going to be such a logjam waiting for us around the corner in the second half of 21.
I'll just jump in. In the Cree territory, and like many of the communities that Cashel and Daniella are referring to, it's far better, and Benoit also mentioned it, to deal face to face. Half of the communication is body language, and you lose that. But the best Zoom call you can have, you lose the body language. So that creates issues, in my view, to make sure that if, on both sides we properly understand each other. Then there could be language issues as well, but that is greatly missed. And even in our own team, and board meetings, team meetings, it's easy to connect. It's hard to communicate the way we really want to.
Understood. Well, listen, we've already touched a bit upon it about negative impacts, so let's explore that a bit. Obviously, there have been many on the mining sector and throughout all industries, but if I were to ask you to make your top three lists of what's been the major negative impacts of this pandemic on your operations, what would they be? So Benoit, I'd like to ask you that first.
Yeah, well, as we discussed, I think that the number one impact was on employees, them either stuck on site or not being able to come to site. I mean, so anything that is HR related has been massive. I mean, massive. Your recruitment was more difficult. Sending people abroad was more difficult. So HR to me has been the number one issue for probably most companies, but for a mining company. And now, as we often and there's very strong competition in the field at the moment, so it's even more difficult. Now, that to me was the number one. The second element is on suppliers. Suppliers not able to come to site, not able to travel to site, not able to have their employees. They didn't want to come. It was you couldn't get people to work. They were scared. They didn't want to come. So you have your own employees having issues, and as we all indicated, you rely on subcontractors for development costs, for sustainable capex costs, and they. In our case, they just didn't want to come to site. So we had almost to beg and get them to come to site, and it became very difficult to operate. So your employees are there and they are staying way too long. Your suppliers don't want to come. And the last element, which I know we will talk at length, is supply chain disruption. I mean, that is, it started last year, but now it's becoming a real issue. So, with all of that's like a recipe for difficult times, and we manage all of it. But it's if you ask me what are the three most important elements, those were the elements. I mean, but the number one was really employees, how to manage them, how to make sure they were safe, and especially for the first and second phase. We were lacking information. So, even us in Canada, we were lacking information. So they thought that, you would catch this, and it could be very dangerous. So people just preferred to stay home, and it was very, very difficult. So employees, suppliers, and started and now supply chain are the three most touched for me elements of this COVID-19 situation.
Thank you, Benoit. Cashel, what about you? I presume there'll be some similarities, but
very, very similar list. And it makes you think of other things when you hear the other operators talk about their own challenges. But So I have logistics sort of down, and that would include sort of accommodation and supply chain. Lead times on items have all increased, especially if you're in a capital build project. So we're building a gold plant and expanding a mine in northern Manitoba, and lead times on items that might have been not engineered properly or not spec'd properly, and you take for granted you can change them out, and they might be bottlenecks to the startup of the plant. Others are just items you take for granted in sort of a maintenance shutdown, things like liner changes, and getting foundries to do liners on time and having them come in on time. It's a big deal now, because those foundries themselves have restricted their productivity, right? So whereas they could have satisfied 10 customers in a given month, now they're saying they won't deliver these things to you for 18 months. On the HR end, as Benoit mentioned, travel constraints, things from OEMs to help you do your ramp up of your projects, to having specialists come on site to look at your tailings progress, or OEM reps to be able to solve mechanical issues that you might have. All these things take longer because, eyes on a problem is totally different than trying to do these things remotely. And not to belabor it, but the third most challenging thing is inflation, and it's going to be an issue. We're lucky in the mining industry, I take it, that we've had an increase in the metal prices, as John mentioned it from the start. But certainly our base cost has changed, and I don't see it changing anytime soon going forward. So, someone who published technical reports just before the pandemic, and then we're being asked why there's a major variance. Well, everything costs more now. People, shipping your product, diesel, electricity, steel, everything costs more. So that's the other major one, I'd say, that's a negative impact on things going forward, that there seems to be a substantive price change sort of in your base costs. Like I would say similar in the mining industry to about 10%.
Wow, that's significant. Daniella, I'd like to turn it over to you, because just like Hudbay, IAMGOLD's got operations in Canada and abroad. So let's talk about your challenges. Your negative impacts, and
Yeah, they're very similar, Frank, to what my colleagues have mentioned. Probably the number one would be similar to Benoit, human resources, and that going from initially, the shutdown. So taking that into consideration, as I mentioned, for us in Suriname, availability, and that. Ultimately, that indirect impact, the direct and indirect impact that it has. To give you an example, for us in Suriname, that the cases that we had occurred in clusters, and so it's not that we would have someone from maintenance and someone from mining being impacted. We had at one time our entire maintenance team out on COVID, and so. When you're going through at least a 2-week period, maybe sometimes even longer, where you're actually unable to do that function, which is so critical to the operations, that has almost like a magnified impact than just me saying to you, we had 14 cases on site. And that really occurred to us with a number of our functions as recently as August. I'm not sure if we're now into the fourth phase or fifth phase, or what number phase we are in Suriname, but we had an impact on our finance team, where almost our entire finance team was impacted and out for at least 2 weeks. So we're still seeing that lingering effect and that magnified effect of it. So human resources and labor was probably the most material impact. And then really the logistics and everything that my colleagues have covered, from initially bottlenecks in the supply chain and being able to have access to PPE, and so that you can implement the protocols that you want to implement, and really that has now cascaded into managing through a supply chain that has a lot of bottlenecks in it. For us, maybe that's a bit different than for Cashel and Hudbay. At the end of the day, we can still fly the gold out. And so we're not dealing with bulk materials on that front. I know one of the companies that I'm on the board of where we're talking bulk materials and getting concentrate from A to B and availability of containers and the impact on freight. That's something, that's certainly been a disruption, and it's one that we're seeing continue.
Interesting. Norma, before I turn it over to you, I'm interested about that aspect of operations in Canada versus abroad, and maybe both again to you, Cashel and Daniella. I mean, is there something that you would qualify as a negative impact in an operation abroad that you wouldn't qualify as having that kind of negative impact in Canada, for example? Is there one particular that stems out from, or not really?
Yeah, maybe. One of the unique things with Peru during this particular pandemic is they have a very bipolar political system, and they've brought in a very left-leaning socialist radical sort of president. And there were lots of demonstrations. There was a lot of political activity. There was a lot of non-conformance to rules. And because they were going through this process, there was very little government interaction. So no one did themselves any benefit from this, and it's ended sort of in a metastable environment where there's enough people that don't agree that nothing changes, which is good for operations and it's good for mining. But I think one of the, if I could talk about one specific item, it was the fact that the access to vaccines, something we took for granted in Canada, I think something that was great. We're up at 75% and up in our Manitoba operations, and we can really encourage and do that, whereas they're still working through things in Peru. The 30 to 50-year-old group hasn't got access to vaccines yet, and that's the bulk of our employees, 20 to 40 now, so they don't have access. And then the other is their supply is Sinopharm, and there's a lot of controversy about where the vaccine's from and what the vaccine is. And we, with the mining community in Peru, had availability after the first world got their vaccines to be able to bring in vaccines, maybe address some of the workforce in the communities and sustain sort of the GDP out of Peru. And that was presented to the Peruvian government, but it was viewed as that's unequal. So they would rather not have anybody vaccinated rather than have a process to have everybody vaccinated. So that was very frustrating. In fact, in the end, much of our management group has flown out to places like Miami just to get vaccinated and to go back such that they can function, get to site, and not worry about things. So I think that's one of the unique things that would be extremely different between Canada and Peru.
What about you, Daniella? Any particular item?
A similar comment. Suriname has been very slow to procure vaccines. And so really that's just started coming in probably in July, August. I know there was a larger shipment coming in towards the end of August. And then I know that in various jurisdictions, the acceptability of vaccines has been different. And, in a country like, for example, Brazil, who I think is very vaccine embracing, that's been different than, for example, in Suriname, where more efforts have gone into educating the population and certainly our workforce and communicating around that on that front. Burkina has been similar in terms of vaccine availability, and notwithstanding, we've made some efforts through COVAX and the Red Cross of wanting to facilitate greater access on that front. And although we've been able to contribute capital, certainly we haven't been able to buy vaccines directly and actually make them available to the workforce. In Canada, it's been obviously, you could say that we've had vaccine availability, although I'm going to suggest that maybe it's been slower than we may have thought, if you asked me that question in 2020, but that's for another day. We've encouraged at Cote, we've encouraged our contractors by offering a small financial incentive to encourage people to actually get vaccinated on that front. So those really have been primarily the key differences between the operations.
Interesting. Normand, I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, your operations are in a remote area, not easy. And obviously on the exploration side, you don't have an active mine right now. But what's been the challenge for your operations? I mean, the negative impacts. I'm sorry.
Similar to my colleagues, I would say people, and by that I include contractors, also supply and logistics, and communications, which I mentioned earlier. People, because in Quebec, like many other places, we have a crisis, human resources crisis to get qualified people, and COVID has made it worse. Some people decided not to continue to work in that field, or some people got sick, some of them, and because of the heated competition, and then some people decided to jump ship, which creates disruptions as well. We've seen that at the lab, particularly the lab we're dealing with is the largest in Quebec, based in Val d'Or, and they had to recruit people that didn't get the government subsidy because they were willing to move to Val d'Or, get room and board paid, and then work at the lab. And now they're resorting to the strategy, because they run out of those people, to go abroad in French-speaking countries like Morocco, Benoit, for example, or Algeria, maybe, or others. It's easier to travel now. So we're lucky in James Bay that we have good infrastructure. It is remote, but it is accessible. You have paved roads. You can work 12 months of the year. And there were checkpoints at one point, but it has, COVID has slowed down the access to the territory for the right reasons. And communications I've mentioned, because, at the end of the day, the work has to be done, and we have to communicate face to face to make it more effective in a regular fashion, and that is not happening as much as we'd like to, and that's really has slowed down. Overall, I would say costs have gone up probably 10-15% because of supply chain and the slower speed of doing things.
Okay, thank you, Norma. Well, let's explore another topic now. I mean, obviously, you've all touched upon it in your answers about measures that you put in place on your respective operations. Talked about water testing for IAMGOLD, which is pretty interesting, I have to say. Benoit mentioned being a country within a country and its own operation. So I'd like us to talk a bit more about that, of the specific measures that you had to take, which you've already talked a bit about, but also to hear you of how these measures evolved over time, right? Because I mean, we're all living this for the first time, so we're all adapting as things go by. But I'd like to hear, I'd really like to see how these measures evolve over time. So Cashel, and we'll start with Cashel and Normand after, and then we could maybe explore it with Benoit and Daniella. So Cashel.
Sure. I sort of spoke about one, and I'll talk about it. It's the quarantining in Peru, and to some respects in Manitoba also. And so in Manitoba early on, and I mentioned sort of the community and the local population, we have a mix. We have a lot of people that need to fly in or travel in. And we know ourselves in Canada that there are different pockets early on of where the virus was prevalent. And so, I wasn't allowed to go to Manitoba by, our own standards for about 6 months. And we, because I was from Peel region and it was one of the hotbeds. And so we were blanketed off and I couldn't go to the operations, but, Sudbury was okay. So we could move people from Sudbury there. And that made a big difference to the community that, is Cashel coming? Because we don't want him here. He's from Peel region, right? It didn't matter what my lifestyle was or what it was. And so that was a major thing for them. And that wasn't such quarantining, but it was sort of this xenophobia of like, okay, we hear about these things and they paint everybody with the same brush, whereas I'm from Peel region and I know there were pockets in Peel region that were the issue, not all of Peel region. So if we take that sort of to Peru, it's the exact same thing. You know, like we have people from the north of Peru, we have people from Lima, we have people from Arequipa, we have people from Cusco, and sort of it was, you know, the pandemic was hitting them, you know, at different times, both severely. But this idea I spoke about before of the quarantining from up to 11 days and doing daily testing and getting false positives, as Daniella mentioned to begin with, extremely disruptive, because you get a false positive and then you get a negative, and then somebody can get on a bus. They're on a bus for 6 hours, but then they do some tests and then they retest and they find out they didn't test properly. They got to retest everybody. Now you got to stop the bus, right? Because now you've got 40 people on a bus, and are these people all infected now because of this one retest and positive? So it was extremely disruptive. With the onset of the vaccine, what we're seeing is we have to be very mathematical about it. Like, who's got the vaccine? When did they get it? You know, you guys go on a different bus. These other people are being treated differently because you have to quarantine for 11 days on your days off, right? When you go in for 21 days and then you come back out for 14, then you get 3 days with your family and you're back in quarantine again, but the government won't allow you to get a vaccine, right? So what has been changing is gradually with the vaccine and the adoption of the vaccine, we've been gradually being able to reduce the quarantine time, which is for mental health reasons for these people that only get to spend 3 days in a month with their family, a big deal. So that would be one of the extreme examples of something we've had to do. You know, it's at least we seem to be looking at the light at the end of the tunnel. You know, this fourth Delta wave, we'll see how it affects Peru, but we see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Thanks, Cashel. Normand?
So similar to Cashel about coming from another region being viewed as a bad region. As you know, Montreal was, you almost say, the epicenter of COVID when it started, and I'm based in Montreal. So we go anywhere, especially to the Cree tourists, they say, oh, you're from Montreal. It doesn't matter who you are, you're not coming. Even our own team, and we've agreed to that. Now that we are vaccinated, we can sort of go back to almost normal, I would say. But as I mentioned earlier, the Cree, and I have to take my hat off to them, they've been very considerate, very careful. In Wemingee, that little community, they haven't had a single case from the start of the pandemic. That's quite remarkable. But they remain careful, and we have to respect that, and we have to work with that. So that has, you know, I mentioned people as the largest impact on the pandemic, and that's what it is. It's how you move people, how they can interact. We don't have to transport people by buses, but we do fly. Well, flights, of course, were canceled initially, and then they had to go on a reduced frequency. And then you got an issue of driving, and driving for a long distance for some of our contractors and employee could be an issue. This is where you get typically accidents, and that's the greatest cause of injury or issues from a safety standpoint in the exploration industry. So we have to make sure that we have proper communication with our vehicle, that we have more reinforcement with respect to safety for anyone that's driving from the south to the north to the James Bay region.
Thanks. Benoit, I mean, yeah, like I said, I'm going to quote you again, a country within a country. That doesn't happen overnight. These measures evolved over time. So maybe you could talk to us about these measures and how they evolved, you know, to become what you say is a country.
Yeah. And I want to tell you, our country is a dictatorship, and I'm quite proud of it. So it's I'm just kidding, but no, we had to become a country and to put in our own rules. And one thing it took a little bit of time is we introduce testing. So we have random testing, and we test people regularly all the time. And we pick some positive cases and then mostly negative, but and you know, it takes a bit of time for people to adjust to that. But at the end of the day, it's good for the mind, it's good for the communities, it's good for you know the motivation, and we've introduced that because it is extremely important, because at the end. And we haven't touched that, but we as management, senior management, we have a responsibility. We're responsible. Like in our top 10 individual here at AYA, 5 caught COVID. Some got it lightly, others got it pretty bad. But at the end, if I'm saying, oh, we got to go to site, you guys need to do this, we have to oversee construction of this, and then we send 2-3 people from Canada, they come back and one has a very severe case, how do you feel? So it's really like our responsibility to be extremely prudent and humbling, because when you have people around you, and we had one very severe case, I'm telling you, you realize you don't want to catch this. And it's not the age. I mean, between 30 and 40, if they have a bad case, it's very bad. So we need to be really prudent, but not take it lightly, because it can be deadly, and it's deadly around us. Like it's our people, it's the people we see every day. So it's extremely important to take this serious. We do, but you understand that we have a responsibility as leaders. So we created a country, and nobody can go in. So that's the good thing. All of us will tell you now, we don't go with analysts or investment bankers, and we don't take shareholders, which is a great thing. It's quite nice to have a break. And we made that clear, over a year ago, like more than a year ago. Nobody goes on site unless there's a very real good reason. It's a supplier, it's technical, but no visit just to go and have a visit. So, and we made that very, very strict. And same thing for suppliers. I mean, you can't bring in people, they want to show the job, or no. Everybody needs a good reason to come. They need to be tested, obviously. And this is something we just do not, there's no tolerance. It's zero tolerance on this. And we run it as, and our local management, they are aware. It's their thinking, and they're making sure that we respect all of these rules. But it's a country within a country. Though Morocco, I have to say, though they were touched badly, they did manage this quite well. And as Cashel said, they don't have access to Pfizer or Moderna. They have Sinovac. And that's another question, and we won't go there, but is it 30% efficient, 40% efficient? And in developing countries, that's also a reality, and it's something we have to live with. So anyway, but yes, you have to act and create your own little country within a country.
Thanks, Benoit. Daniella, I'm mindful of the time. You got to leave soon. The next question, I really want to hear your thoughts on it. Is there anything you'd like to add to this question on your measures? Maybe go ahead.
Maybe just a couple of things, because our industry really comes from that culture of health and safety. And so that initial reaction to what was happening maybe came more easily for us than another industry, because we not only are used to the safety culture, have PPE and inventory, and we're really able to react almost immediately. More so than a number of other industries. Where we had to evolve, and all my colleagues touched on it, is as the pandemic itself evolved, right? And as we got to learn more about it, and understand about how it was being passed from person to person, we obviously had to react, and the availability of antigen testing has been more so in other countries. I mean, I can tell you in South America, that was something that was, again, more available and accepted and allowed earlier on than it was in Canada. And that was able to be introduced there before it was being able to be introduced in Canada. And then you make those adjustments. So, initially testing at the gate, and testing more on a sample basis, on a random basis, to then testing everybody at the gate, to then realizing that if you're going to put people on a bus or a plane to get them to the gate to test them, that's not such a good idea. And then you're testing everybody before they get on the bus or before they get on the plane. So really what I wanted to add is I think we were better equipped to immediately respond, and we adjusted along the way as we learned more and more tools that became available to us to be able to actually manage through it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Daniella. Let's move on now. Obviously, ESG is a very hot topic, with reason. And let's talk about, how is the pandemic affected your focus and approach on ESG related matters? Daniella, I'd love to hear you on that.
Yeah, I think it's really accelerated the focus, not just within the industry and our shareholders, stakeholders, but I think the world around that. The number of conversations that we're all having about climate change, about income equality, equality in general, diversity, have really accelerated, and they have been accelerated by the pandemic, in my opinion. I think we were going to get there. We were progressing. However, I think that we were progressing at a much slower pace. So it's really, in my opinion, has highlighted the pockets of inequality, has really brought forward the impact of climate change. I mean, I think about our operation in Suriname, and in addition to being severely impacted, I would say, by COVID, we had a period in Suriname, and I know in Brazil as well, of really, really heavy rains this rainy season. One of those 1 in 20 events. And maybe in another year, in a different year, that would have been just, something that you would have managed through. For some reason, I think that's again been elevated from an impact perspective and from pressure on industries to actually deal with it and to do better. I know we talked a lot about communities, and it really brought forward the fact that some governments are just not equipped to deal with something like this. The health system in some of the countries in which we operate, I mean, we saw our own health system in Canada, in some cases and in some provinces, being crippled by this. And you can imagine in a country like Suriname, just in countries in Africa that just don't have the resources to deal with this. So the expectation on the part of the communities that don't want to talk to you in person is certainly that you step in the shoes of government and provide oxygen and provide PPE, in addition to the other community programs that you had in place as part of operating in that particular jurisdiction. So a lot of impacts and a lot of complexities that I think have been just elevated by the impact of the pandemic.
Thank you, Benoit. I know ESG has always been a very important topic for you, even when you were at SEMAFO. So let's hear your take on this.
100% with Daniella. It has accelerated the whole concept. I mean, it has accelerated because the governments, are overwhelmed. The local population often were left behind, and they come to you, and you're the only one there with some means, and so you can't isolate yourself within your fence. If it's fenced in, you have to be outside and you have to work. The ESG concept values have always been there, but the implementation and the acceleration is absolutely true. And what Daniella said, that these events, these weather events that we have them everywhere. We have them in Africa. We had one in Morocco. We saw in Spain and in Germany, the floods were, it's everywhere. But those countries have a balance sheet where we're operating. In many countries, they don't have a balance sheet. Hence, they can't support that. So it comes back to the mining companies that are there, that are operating, that are, taking something out of the earth, and that's something they come right back at you. So yeah, the ESG is becoming more, and it was important, and now it's really becoming even more important. And communication and with the government and with the local community is extremely important.
Thanks, Benoit. Normand, anything to add on that?
I completely agree with Benoit and Daniella. I've always said over the years that the ESG is the critical success factor of our industry. I look at this pandemic as having a very positive effect in forcing an acceleration, as Daniella mentioned, of our focus on ESG. And we are doing the same at our scale. I mean, we are trying to get closer, as close as possible, even if we don't have the right communications with our local communities, the tallyman, having them really understand what's happening. That is so critical. This is the first thing we look at, making sure we can be a successful exploration company.
Anything you'd like to add, Cashel? I mean, you caught my attention when you talked about the bipolar system in Peru and what you've proposed to the government from, I'm sure you have something to say on this ESG matter.
You know, I would echo what my fellow panelists have already said. Certainly, the focus on ESG has been heightened. I think it's something our industry has always done well. They've always maintained a social license. They've always been able to do these things under various acronyms, MAC or TSM, and these things from us Canadian companies. You know, the fact that, you know, the governance world and the investment community is demanding this now, I think they're catching up to us, and I think that's great. I think what it is it shows where mining companies are, is, you know, there's a focus on compassion and empathy for where we operate. You know, the local governments that don't have that infrastructure that have been highlighted by the other panelists, it's the same in Peru. You know, we've had to provide the healthcare, we've had to provide the you know, bring in more supplies and food and these various things and medicines and oxygen and all these sorts of things. And so it just shows how the mine and the community have integrated with each other. They're symbiotic, and to move it forward. And one would hope that, you know, whichever governments are running these places recognize that these institutions are bringing benefits to their country. And so I think it looks well on the mining communities. It's just none of these mining enterprises are big enough to fix a whole country on their own.
Yeah, of course. Okay, well, we're in the final stretch. We may have time for two other questions, at least one for sure, because we are getting a lot of questions from the audience, and I would like to have the chance to ask some of them to you. Let's talk. We did talk about it a bit. Let's talk about, you know, the shortage of available workforce and its effect on your operations. Obviously, we're seeing that every day as we go outside. We try to get into a restaurant, closed, not enough staff. Many reasons that explain that, but it is a reality. And so, you know, how's it affected your operations? And are there any particular steps that you've tried to put in place to recruit new talent with your businesses? Normand?
So that's a very good question. I alluded to it earlier in my responses. With respect to drillers, which is a major cost for what we do, we've seen cannibalizing of one drilling firm versus another, and to the point where, you know, the market became very heated and they started raising the prices because they had to keep the best drillers in place. And we saw in the spring, I saw in Quebec, overnight increase of 15% on drilling contracts. It sounds like not a lot, but it's a lot of dollars if you drill a lot of meters. So the best way to go around that is show that you have better conditions and that there are longer term perspective, and to make sure that the drilling company can also possibly recruit other drillers elsewhere. So you work with them, you don't try to be against them. To a point where also in Quebec, we had to not really send requests for proposals for drilling contracts, but use, you know, the relationships that you have, use the people that would do a good job, and prepare to work, and hopefully under better conditions in a new area they are not accustomed to. So that's been the critical aspect of our business, has been affected by the shortage of available workforce, qualified workforce. I think the longer term solution is obviously training of people that are not doing drilling, for example. And this is what the lab also is doing. I've mentioned in Val-d'Or, they're now going abroad to bring people that have the basic education, if you wish, and some skills, but to train them and show them that you can have a good life in Val-d'Or. You can be well paid, and it could be quite interesting. So that's what I had to say on that topic.
Okay, thank you, Normand. Benoit, any challenges on the shortage of workforce, and what measures are you trying to recruit new talent?
It's Adam Smith, supply and demand. I mean, so you have to be able to pay, and sadly, so for the more junior explorer, it's going to be more and more difficult to get the better geos, and what we're going to see, sadly, are casualties of projects that try to go to production or try to go to development, and they have the C or the D team, and mining is a very technical industry, and unless you have the A team, you really run into problems. We do a lot of due diligence, looking at other projects, and we see so many basic mistakes that are made because the team isn't there anymore. There's no team. So it's a reality like we see in North America, in the restaurant industry, we see it in the mining industry, but it's supply and demand. And if you are there in production with some good assets, making some money, it's inflation. As we said, there is inflation in our sector right now, and there is definitely inflation for top quality people, but they are there. I mean, they are there. You just have to go in and get them and bring them on board, and then create momentum in your company to keep them with you as you're developing your assets. So, but it will create serious casualties, and we had quite a few in Quebec of those casualties in the last 5 years. We're not going to name them all because I don't think we have time, but we had a lot of casualties in the mining sector for badly developed and executed projects.
Yeah. What about the Cashel? Any particular thoughts regarding Peru or Manitoba operations on this issue?
Yeah, I would say that, the primary focus when your whole industry is under pressure, certainly these cost pressures and recruitment pressures, is on the production. And so you try and maintain production because those are your cash flows. So a lot of the effort goes towards that. But what then suffers is your organic growth pipeline. Things like exploration, things like capital projects, improvement projects, productivity projects. And to be honest with you, that's what your best people like to work on. And so if you're not able to focus on those and you don't have the people to focus on those, this is going to have an effect on the future pipeline of products like we produce, like copper, for example. I would suspect that capital cost has gone up on copper projects around the world, and I would suspect that capital projects are delayed. And those two things are going to have a profound effect. Copper broke through $4 earlier this year. I don't know that anyone predicted that. And so, the industry or the investment community is looking for us to bring forward all these organic growth projects and all these processes. But under this pandemic, it's been very difficult to get any sort of traction to move these things forward. And I think that's something the industry wrestles with.
Mm-hmm. So before we take questions, Cashel, I mean, the shortage of workforce versus disruption in the supply chain, right? So if you were to say, this is obviously affecting your operations, but what about the disruption in the supply chain and everything that you just stated in terms of effects on projects, effect on pricing?
Yeah, I think we see it from some of our peers. One of our peers has said that they've suffered capital cost increase of $600 million on a major project in Chile. I mean, that's severe. And if that's right, that's going to have a delay effect. You don't spend more and hold the same timeline. That's very rare in our industry. Normally the spend comes because of more. I think that the demand thing is where we're going to miss it is, it's easy to spot the big projects when they're delayed or they're behind or they cost more. It's in the actual operations. And, in Peru and Chile, they're the number 1 and 2 producer, for example, the commodity copper in the world. And we see with our peers and ourselves that if we're getting behind on things like pre-strip, we're going to eventually have to change our minds, right? We're going to have to change the way we mine them, and there's going to be higher costs in the future, and there might be a little bit less production. And these delays can't be sorted out right now. It's a domino effect, and it'll take several years for it to see. But what it'll do is prolong this sort of bull run, maybe, but certainly that'll be commensurate with inflation.
Benoit, I know that this is a topic you wanted to discuss, the disruption in the supply chain. I know you've had some challenges at your end, so love to hear you on that.
Well, over the years, we've been all looking at China for parts and for ball mill and for crusher, and now we're paying the price. I mean, the spare parts are being mainly manufactured in China, and now just as Daniella mentioned, shipping has gone up 400%. Now they're having energy issues this winter, so they have major blackouts. And we will be waiting for parts. We're waiting for, you see the effect in the automobile industry. You're seeing the effect in the mining space. So beside the spare parts, if you have a large CapEx project on the go, I mean, you have to be extremely careful because there's real issue on supply chain, real issue. Like what, normally, your liners for ball mills, you would wait normally, 2 months or 3 months. Now you have to wait 8 or 9 months if you get them. So it's let's say you have a problem, you have to change them ahead of time. Then you're operating without spare parts, and that's a disaster for a mine to operate without critical spare parts. So it's the logistics and supply chain management is going to be the challenge for 2021, 2022, 2023. It's extremely serious. So with the HR issues, which you have to manage with, and then the supply chain management, you have to be very careful and not start projects that are not extremely well planned, and even those are going to be difficult.
So on the disruption of the supply chain issue, we're going to get in now to the segment on questions, because I have a question that's directly related to that. And is to say what can companies do to alleviate the worst effects of the supply chain? And the question is, do they need to invest more in logistics, infrastructure, ports, ships, railways to have more control over the transport of their products and the product themselves? That's the question we have from the audience.
Well, maybe I can take that, Frank. First of all, you have to look for new suppliers. I mean, that's what we're doing right now. We're trying to get parts made now in Europe, which they have not been making them for a while because China was so inexpensive, or India. And now we're saying no more of that. I mean, so we will pay a little bit more, we understand, and we're willing to commit to some new suppliers and say, we need this and we need that, because you just cannot rely on parts coming in from Asia with the shipping situation, with their, the plants there are all running late. So you have to look for new ways of doing things, and you have to shorten your delivery route. It's got to be closer. You have to find a way to make it closer. Otherwise, it's then there's too many risks. There's the fabrication risk, then there's shipping to port, then port to your port. I mean, it's too risky. So for us in West Africa and North Africa, we're looking at Europe. We can look at South Africa as well. That's not so far, but looking at China and India at the moment, we're trying to stop that because it's way too risky.
Mm-hmm. Cashel, what about for Hudbay?
Yeah, I think a lot of our suppliers are better at their business than we are. My view is we can't become more vertically integrated, where we're getting into either the manufacturing or the marketing or those types of things. Those volumes are better done efficiently. Historically, by Caterpillar's better off building trucks and doing that, for example. So what I will do is use a small adage, right? Like, everybody's trying to find a secret recipe now to solve all the problems. And, but right now I feel where we are is kind of like what Benoit said, is, sourcing in other places. But the adage I'll use is, if we're in the woods, Frank, and we come across a bear, I don't have to outrun the bear. I only have to outrun you. Right. And so that's the way it is in the mining industry now. We talk about contractors getting poached and things like that. So, our warehouse procurement and logistics team have to be better than the next ones and more clever and come up with new innovative ways just to get through this period until hopefully this pandemic's over. So that's what I have to say about that is that is the primary focus, such that we can do our shutdowns and our sustaining capital programs such that we're able to sustain production in the future.
Very interesting. So I have another question here that I'd really like to. Very interesting is, do you think the pandemic has caused or will cause an increase in digital technology investment for mining in the mining industry? I'd love to hear all of you.
I'll jump in for a minute. I think that's true. I think it will accelerate it because we need to have the best communications possible to replace what we're doing face to face. I think there's been an overall trend, especially in the last few years, to make mining more digital and more robotized, if you wish. And I think we're going to see more of that. In the mine of the future is obviously a mine where you're going to have remote control from cities, where you do as much as possible remotely, when having SWAT teams intervene when it's required. And there's a considered effort in many places to have this new technology implemented, especially for new mines. Obviously, it's much easier. So I think we're going to see an acceleration of investment, especially for new projects.
Cashel, me.
Yeah. There's no doubt. There are two draws. Like the pandemic has exposed, things like a remote central operation of, right now we remote operate centrally our mill at the mill site. There are all sorts of PLCs and logic, and that we're able to do that. There's no reason why they can't be done from Lima or from Toronto or from somewhere else. I think that'll all get accelerated. That all comes with the new risk of cybersecurity, and so that's a big issue there. But I think the other draw on innovation and technology is actually what we touched on before on the workforce, which I think is a bigger issue. It's appealing to a younger generation that this is a good industry to work in, and they demand it. And we see it from they're the adopters of innovation. They're the adopters of technology. And if we want to attract 20 and young 30-year-olds to our industry, then we have to invest in that technology. We have to bring that technology, and we have to also promote that that's what we want to do. So I think the pandemic has exposed the problem. And then I think it's the only solution going forward if we want to keep a sustainable workforce and bring new people into it, because we're competing with the worlds of, Microsoft and Google for these talented people that can bring innovation to the industry. So that's what I would add.
So Benoit, possible Scunder mine operated remotely out of Casablanca?
Yes and no, because we also want to create many jobs in the area, and that's something that it is extremely important. So yes, we are going electronics, and yes, we will be investing. The plant will be the new plant. We're building a new plant. It will be computerized and all this. And yes, we're using all the tools available. But at the end of the day, as well, our responsibility is for all the well-being of the people around us. And we are the only economic dynamo in the region that can create jobs, and that will share the wealth. So we're not going with, as what Normand said, which is would exist in Australia, where you have automatic mines and mining and all of that. It exists, it's there. But no, we're not going there. Not in developing countries. I mean, it's the workforce at that level is available. In developing countries, if you need miners and you need truck operators and all that, there's no issue there. You have plenty. The scarcity is more into the more qualified metallurgists and mine planners and at higher level. But for the local people to work, there are no issues. We have plenty of workforce.
Okay, thank you. We have time for, I guess, maybe one last topic / question. There's an interest in it. It's not clear as, have you installed a mandatory vaccine policy for your employees on your sites or within the company, or How do you manage that?
I can go. It's so in Manitoba, what we do is we're encouraging everybody to get their vaccines. We're providing them with the necessary resources from the local public health authority and things. We haven't got to the point of necessarily mandating, but what we've done is we've made the opposite choice more difficult with frequent testing. So if you're not going to get your vaccine, you will have to be very frequently, maybe as much as 72 hours or 48 hours, be tested for it. We already have that sort of protocol of testing in place in Peru. In Peru, really, the uptake of the vaccine is very good, and we hope that continues. We hope the efficacy of that particular vaccine is proven to be strong, but without a choice, that's where they're sort of stuck. So I see recently many of the governments, or our federal government might, as soon as today, announce that for their civil workforce. If that's the case, we'll review what our policies are. But in the meantime, we think it's very strong that somebody has to sustain lots of testing versus getting a vaccine. And we think that's a good incentive for this phase we're in.
Okay, Benoit, what about, I know you talked about that. Do you have a mandatory vaccine?
We don't, but there was no need. Morocco did a very good job at that. And so we did not have to, because people were being vaccinated and they were all, positive and about the being vaccinated. So we did not have to. I mean, it's great. We did not have to make that decision because it's a very delicate decision. But there was no need because everybody is vaccinated in Montreal and in Casablanca and at Zugunda on site. Okay.
All right. Well, thanks. Well, gentlemen, we lost Daniella had to leave, as you know, at 1:10. Normand just had to drop off to go on another call. So this concludes our roundtable. I wanted to thank you very much for your insight, your answers. Very, very interesting. Obviously, this pandemic is evolving. We're all adapting to it, and it's not the last time we're going to speak about it, obviously. So I want to thank you, Benoit and Cashel, for having accepted our invitation. It was really a pleasure and an honor to spend the last hour and a half with you. Thank you very much for your insight. I hope we'll get to do this again, maybe in a year from now, to see how things have changed or have evolved. And I'd like to thank the audience for their questions and everybody who attended. I hope you enjoyed the roundtable. And there'll be more like that for Fasken coming up, the PDAC, usually our seminar. You'll get an email from us shortly with our agenda for PDAC with our seminars, and I understand there will be a 2-day live session in person at Toronto. So maybe Benoit and Cashel we'll get to see each other and have a drink and talk about this. But and again, thanks again. Thank you, everybody. And have a wonderful day, and talk soon. Bye-bye.